back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. You know, it seems to me that that diplomacy seems to have gotten something of a bad name lately in a way that it didn't even during the Cold War. It's been striking to me to watch how negative so many people are about talking with your enemies, which is one critical aspect of what diplomacy is, right? You don't settle disagreements by talking to your friends. You settle them by talking to your enemies. That's something that seemed to be better understood, believe it or not, even in the Cold War than it is today. And that's the topic of one of the pieces I wanted to discuss with my next guest. James Carden is a columnist with Globetrotter Media, and and you can also find his work sometimes in The Nation and Responsible Statecraft and elsewhere. And he's recently co-written a couple of pieces with Katrina vanden Heuvel of The Nation, who has been on this program a number of times herself. And these two pieces I thought were both very interesting and timely. So first of all, James Carden, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Well, it's good to have you, and particularly on such an important subject. The first piece that you and Katrina wrote was published a few months ago, actually, on the anniversary in October 2022, the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I should start out by saying, James, just as a sort of personal note, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 9 years old, and I remember the fear. I remember the anxiety. I remember the kind of unstated things my parents were dealing with. We also lived on the approach path to an Air Force base in upstate New York. So I remember going out when I'd hear a plane coming in to see is one of ours, quote unquote, or one of theirs. So, I mean, this was we came extremely close, correct me if I'm wrong, but we came extremely close to a nuclear apocalypse then. And so first of all, if you agree with my framing of it, that we came close to Armageddon, I guess my first question, how did we get out of it?
Well, I do agree with that. And the way we got out of it was by talking with our adversary. And the relationship between President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev actually began to deepen and kind of set the stage for a peaceful end to the Cuban Missile Crisis due to the communications that the two had over the preceding year's crisis in Berlin. So they were able to keep an open line of communication. They spoke very frankly to each other in letters. And of course, they had numerous back channels during the course of the crisis. The president used his brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, to speak with the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Mr. Dobrynin. And of course, there was a back channel between an ABC newsman named John Scali and Russian intelligence. And so together, the president and the chairman realized something that actually President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev kind of codified in the last decade of the Cold War. They knew that a nuclear war should never be fought because it could never be won. And so the key was speaking to your adversary, but also, and this is something that Katrina and I, picking up on something that Robert Wright has spent a lot of time writing about. The key is kind of taking a minute to walk in the shoes of your adversary. And this is not a new concept. It goes back at least to biblical times, but it seems sadly out of what would you say, out of vogue in today's Washington.
You and Katrina describe that, I shouldn't try to multitask in my head. You and Katrina describe that process in detail in your piece on strategic empathy. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize for the audience was how if anything, much more intense. The antipathy towards the then Soviet Union was in those days, making it even more striking that both sides were able to engage in strategic empathy. This wasn't just a matter of one nation, Russia, challenging the United States or invading a neighbor. This was seen as two competing empires, two competing world visions and ideologies, each despised the other's ideology. The Cold War was raging. It affected, again, children. I was called Eskow from Moscow because my grandparents emigrated from Russia. The just loathing for everything Soviet, everything communist, everything Russian was, if anything, much more intense and widespread in the culture than it is today. And yet, we had a president, dare I say, a Democratic Party, and I would say probably a Republican Party too, that understood the value of negotiation, that understood the horror of nuclear war, and was able to find a listening ear on the other side. So when you and Katrina describe this, now I can't show her the video because I got her name wrong. Now, so when you and Katrina describe this, it's really, and I encourage people to read the piece, it's especially striking because they were able to do this despite this, we have always been at war with blank, blank, blank kind of mentality that was rampant at the time. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do. I think it's also important to recognize that it came down really to the two men who were in charge, and their histories kind of played into this, right? Khrushchev, of course, saw the war from the Soviet point of view, and the Soviets lost upwards of 27 to 30 million people during the Second World War. Kennedy fought heroically in the Second World War, so they saw kind of what the end of the world might look like. And it's important to realize too that, Kennedy, it wasn't like Kennedy's advisors were all pushing him to negotiate with Khrushchev. The ex-com was really overwhelmingly hawkish. His brother sided with him and a few others, but Lyndon Johnson kept pushing for him to react and really felt that the administration's response was weak. The problem that we have today is that we have a president who doesn't have any kind of wartime experience that Kennedy did. He's, I think, clearly not as thoughtful a person as Kennedy was. He doesn't have anyone near the stature of someone like Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy, I believe, was only in his mid to late 30s at the time. And what we are approaching now, thanks to, in large part, the controversy over Trump and Russia and the election, I think we are really at least in Washington, I think we are at Cold War levels of anti-Russia sentiment, if not outright hysteria. And I think that leaves Joe Biden with very little room to maneuver, because I think that he would face a rebellion, not only within his own national security apparatus, but within his own party. And so we are at a really, really dangerous point in U.S.-Russian relations, comparable to Cuba, and comparable to another atomic scare that people generally aren't aware of, the Able Archer incident in 1983, when there was a large NATO exercise, and Russian intelligence had wrongly believed that it was just a cover for an actual invasion of the Soviet Union. So, we were in real trouble then as well. So I guess the reason Katrina and I kind of picked up on the work that Robert Wright had been doing and continues to do about strategic empathy and cognitive empathy is to kind of point away, out of this, and it seems like there, at least within the current administration, I think, with the exception of CIA Director Burns, there are really very few people who understand in depth the history of U.S.-Soviet, U.S.-Russian relations.
And, you raised such a couple of very good points there, James Carden, and I want to explore both of them. One was the lack of military experience. I mean, that has certainly occurred to me too. I had a friend of my parents' generation, very close friend, who died a few years ago, but he directed Meet the Press in the 1950s, one of those things. But he also was with the occupying forces in Italy at the end of World War II. And his observation that he did make about Democrats today was, that because they were never in the army, they don't know what dumb sons of bitches these generals are. And while they're not all quote unquote dumb, I mean, I think he has a point in that, or had a point in that. I think a lot of liberal thinking people today and a lot of Democrats today idealize generals as kind of walking on water, which is a tragic mistake in a country that's supposed to be run by civilians. And for example, JFK, in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think we had Curtis LeMay advising him, Air Force general, who my generation will later come to know and hate for his part in the role in Vietnam. But at the time, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he was telling Kennedy to bomb, to attack. And that he thought we could bomb them back to the Stone Age. Wasn't that Curtis LeMay?
Yes.
So you have people like that. But Kennedy, number one, because he'd been in the military, he knew that military leaders could offer disastrously stupid advice, number one. And number two, because the public knew he'd been a war hero, he could go out there in a way that, we haven't had a Democratic president in 40 years who served in the military. So if I do my math, right, because Jimmy Carter left in 1980. So, but he could go out there. John Kennedy, if a general were ever to say, hey, he didn't take our advice, Kennedy could say, I've been through war, I know war, and I know what needs to be done. So I think that leaves a gap on the Democratic side. I mean, I'm not saying every president should be a war hero, but I think that leaves a missing perspective. And I think there's a whole, people tend to defer far too much to the generals as quote unquote experts. Am I being unfair?
No, not at all. And if you really want to hear what second raters we have at the top of the military, I would urge you to have my friend Colonel Douglas McGregor on to talk about his views of the military. I would say that there's another piece of this, and this again has ties to the Trump-Russia scandal and the kind of hawkish posture of the Democratic Party. And that has been, over the last 7 years, what Katrina has called the valorization of the intelligence community. So not only do the Democrats worship the ground that General Milley walks on, they also worryingly worship the ground that General Petraeus walks on and the ground that Leon Panetta walks on. And this was another thing that John Kennedy understood all too well, and perhaps he paid a horrible price for understanding it.
John Kennedy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but who after the Bay of Pigs said he'd like to break up the CIA into 1,000 pieces, that John Kennedy?
That John Kennedy, and those sentiments were shared by his two immediate predecessors, the man who created the modern intelligence community, Mr. Truman, and General Eisenhower had no love for Allen Dulles, for instance. Indeed, as recently as the 1990s, as what would you say, is eminent, a Democratic senator as Daniel Patrick Moynihan introduced a bill to reform, if not scrap, the current IC. So what we have now, unfortunately, is a Democratic Party, by and large, in thrall to the military and the intelligence community. And you can see the results. There's been absolutely zero pushback about our involvement in this war. We're the ones completely now funding the war, right? The money, we're the ones writing the paychecks to the Ukrainian soldiers, right? Without the United States support, the Ukrainians would collapse in a minute. We've given $113 billion in aid to Ukraine. The second biggest donor is Germany. And would you like to guess how much they've ponied up compared to our 113?
I'm going to guess it's less.
A bit less, about 2.5.
Wow. Wow. No, I would have gotten that off. I would have lowballed it and been way high. So yeah, I point well taken. And just on this one, I would also say, we constantly hear that we have no right to tell the Ukrainians what to do. And we'll get to that, which is true morally, but we do have the right to decide what we're going to do. And we have a moral obligation to do what we're going to do. And if we feel, even strictly thinking of the Ukrainians, that what we're doing now is not in their best interests or ours, we have the right and responsibility to say something. But James Carden, before we get to that, I just a couple last thoughts. First of all, about the intelligence community, it is the idealization of various people. I'm going to point the finger at the Democrats on this one now, of figures like James Comey at one point. James Comey, who told us there were 5,000 active ISIS cells or Al-Qaeda cells in the United States at one point, because that's what the president wanted to hear. The idealization of James Clapper, who, in full understanding of slander and libel laws, I will state for the record, is a perjurer, and perjured himself before...
Well,
what?
Absolutely, I second that.
Okay, sue me, James Clapper, because you're a perjurer. That's but to idealize these people people who, as Mike Pompeo once said, and then I'll stop, but people who, as Mike Pompeo once said, we lie for a living. That's what we do. Of course, it's what you do. So to take their word as gospel is a catastrophic mistake. But I'm sorry, I just wanted to interject that.
No, I couldn't agree more. I would say, you were saying about Ukraine, and really what we've seen, and this is something that a really, really good Russia expert in town named George Beebe has pointed out, and George works at the Quincy Institute. Basically, the administration has surrendered American agency in this war. Mm-hmm. And that's a mistake. And because the one thing that we owe Ukraine, if we're getting into the morality of it, and it's always tricky to do in international relations, but the one thing that we do owe them is the truth. And unfortunately, successive American administrations have not been truthful with Ukraine. And if we had been truthful with them, perhaps we could have avoided the current catastrophe that's now unfolding, because Ukraine is not going to go back to being Ukraine under no circumstances that I can imagine. And I've been studying Russia for well over a decade, and I've studied Stephen F. Cohen was a dear friend and mentor to me. I have studied in Russia. I have traveled widely in Russia and Ukraine and in the Donbass. And under no circumstances is Ukraine going to get back the territories that Russia has already annexed. So right now, Russia controls a fifth of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine's economy year over year has collapsed or disappeared by 30%. 40% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is gone. Now, this is to say nothing of the roughly 100,000 dead that they've suffered. And that might well be a underestimate. All of this could have been avoided if American presidents, policymakers, and people on the Hill had told them the truth, that no matter what was said, no matter what promises had been made at NATO conferences in Bucharest, they were not going to become a member of NATO. All that promises did was arouse the ire and suspicion and anger of the Russians. What we should have done, and I outlined this somewhat in a piece a couple of days ago in the American Conservative, is told them that their greatest strength is their position in Europe, their position as a transit point for Russian natural gas into Europe. But after the Maidan, Kiev was taken over.
The Maidan being, just for those who might not recall, the so-called Maidan Revolution, where there was an uprising against the elected president and I believe elected president, and the government changed. That was in 2014, and I think it's widely understood we had a large part in it, including Victoria Nuland, a former. Is she the one who's a former John Bolton protege? She's close to the neoconservative community, if I recall. Now she has a position in the Biden administration, but she was the one who said F blank 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 the European community when it came to our involvement in that whole uprising. Am I sort of getting that right?
Yeah. Mainly, she was, I'm not sure about Bolton, but she served on Cheney's staff.
Okay.
She was Cheney's national security advisor. She's a career foreign service officer. She's married to Robert Kagan. She is generally seen as the architect of Russian and Eastern European policy across several administrations. And so the wise thing, instead of Victoria Nuland and Senator Chris Murphy and John McCain and the rest of them, instead of them going over and basically participating in this uprising against a democratically elected Ukrainian president, what they should have told them is the truth, is that if they keep pushing this idea of a Ukraine totally free of Russian influence, a Ukraine within NATO, a war was going to come. This current CIA director, a Russia expert, a former ambassador to Russia, William Burns, understood this very well. There's a memo now publicly available in which he said that this is a red line, and it was a red line for Russians who are Westernizers and liberals and opponents of Putin, all the way through to Putin's inner circle and people who are even more hawkish and conservative than Putin himself. But we didn't do that, right? And so, as John Mearsheimer has said, we led Ukraine down a primrose path to disaster because we weren't honest, and there are a number of reasons, probably, why we weren't. There's this idea among the foreign policy establishment that it's up to, countries have a right. It's part of a country's sovereign right to choose whatever alliances they want to be part of. Well, that's fine in theory, I suppose, but it's not fine if you share, your entire eastern border with Russia. And so the theory really means nothing. And
and it's also, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, James, but I also think that goes for both parties, right? I mean, both parties are allowed to exercise their judgment as to whether they want to enter into a deal. So if the United States feels it's unnecessarily provocative to admit Ukraine, or the NATO community as a whole feels it's unnecessarily provocative to admit Ukraine into it, then they have just as much right of a choice as the Ukrainians do. Do you get what I'm trying to say? I mean, this is, both parties have a right to it. You're not robbing the Ukrainians of self-determination. You're choosing not to enter a certain agreement with them, just as perhaps if Canada wanted to enter into a close military alliance with Russia, and place nuclear weapons on the, in Windsor, Ontario or whatever, pointed at Detroit, it's theoretically possible that Russia might decide that's too provocative. We don't want to do that. Then the United States will destabilize, and invade Canada and try to, so I guess my only point to you is that, people have a tendency to look at these kinds of issues from one angle only, which is the angle some people want them to look at it at, and it goes back to my point earlier. Ukraine has a right to want to do a kind of agreement. The other party has a right to engage in it or not. And that's what the conversation should be about. Do we think that's a good idea?
Right. And this is what, Bibi has been talking about surrendering, American agency in this whole ordeal. Right. Who in their right mind would think that Ukraine joining NATO would make the alliance stronger, would increase American, to say nothing of European regional security? It just doesn't really make any sense. And I think the national security establishment and the foreign policy practitioners in this town we're so blinded by our own good intentions that unfortunately kind of blinds them to reality, and the myopia is so strong that they're deaf to the concerns of others. And the idea of anyone saying, you'll never read this in the Washington Post or the New York Times, that Russia itself, whatever you think of Vladimir Putin, whatever you think of of their government's corruption and his own various misdeeds, they still are a country with national security interests of their own. And we've decided, or our foreign policy leaders have decided over the course of 30 years, to time and again ignore them. Well, at some point, there was going to be some sort of pushback. And honestly, 2008, when they went to war with Georgia, that should have been a clue that they are not averse to using military force when they feel that they have to. Again, so we've just repeatedly ignored their concerns. And
now, James, this is usually the part of the conversation where somebody will say to me, if I'm, perhaps not, with as much information, but taking your point of view, where somebody will say, oh, okay, so you're okay with Putin's war crimes. You're defending Putin's war crimes. And my response to that is always, look, if I know I have a neighbor who is violent and fearful, maybe with legitimate reasons to be fearful, but also with a bad temper, and I threaten him, and he breaks into my house and kills my family, it was a bad idea to threaten him. I'm not defending the murder of my family by saying, you warned me not to threaten him, and I threatened him anyway, and I shouldn't have done that. And now what do we? You get what I'm trying to say. I mean, it's a simplistic metaphor, but to me, you can say that what Putin is doing is awful, but also say it was predicted by a lot of people who said, if you do this, he will respond in a certain way. And that's not excusing war crimes. That's explaining what the context of what happened, because we need to figure out a way out of it. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes. I think that, that is a a frequent rhetorical maneuver on the part of these people who are who have been sort of itching for a fight with the Kremlin for many years. And I think it's pretty despicable, given the fact that there's been a handful of us who have been saying for years that this is going to happen if we don't change course. And the reason that we've wanted to prevent this from happening is because with war comes crime, comes terrible, genocide and murder, and the reason that you want to prevent a international dispute into devolving into a war is precisely because these things are going to happen. And so, it's ludicrous to say that those of us who are critical of America's handling of this are turning a blind eye to Russian war crimes. Part of the reason that we've been raising the alarm for so many years is because we knew that such things were going to happen, and sure enough, they are.
And if you have a minute, James, there are just a couple other things I wanted to touch on real quickly, if we can. One is that I mentioned earlier, they called me Eskow from Moscow because my grandparents were from Russia. Well, that part of Russia became Ukraine later, after they left. And I'm eligible for Ukrainian citizenship because of that. But the country didn't exist then. And I guess my point being, borders are malleable. And you mentioned the territories that are not likely in a diplomatic settlement to go back to Ukraine. I think those are majority Russian-speaking territories, are they not?
I can say for certain that two of them are. I don't know if
the third one is. Because referendums, which have been proposed before for the people of those provinces to determine which country they want to belong to, for example, that was part of a proposed diplomatic solution at one point that I think Zelensky maybe even campaigned on in his campaign for president.
Well, that's a good point. Zelensky did campaign as a peace candidate, and somewhere along the line, he was dissuaded either by his own defense and intelligence establishment or our own to cease such efforts. And that's a real tragedy that this man came to the presidency critical of Ukrainian policy under Poroshenko. Poroshenko's policy basically of waging a civil war on the ethnic-speaking citizens.
The Russian-speaking ones or others?
No, the Russian-speaking citizens.
Yeah.
The Donbass, who polling also shows were loyal Ukrainian citizens. So, Zelensky knew at that time that that was a disastrous policy. But here we are.
So is there, it's not a fair question in a way, but certainly, strategic empathy, sort of understanding what's motivating all parties here, the Ukrainians, ourselves, Europe, and of course the Russians. With that in mind, is there a way out? It seems so much tougher now than it might have been a year ago, but there has to be a way out. No, wars can last a very long time, but they don't last forever normally. This could be the exception. If it escalates into nuclear war, it will be, we'll all go with it. But barring that, there'll be some sort of agreement or piece of paper signed somewhere that brings this to an end. Do you see any avenues open for negotiation and, that we should be promoting and encouraging people to think about?
Well, here I am at a loss. I'm really deeply pessimistic. I suspect now that what is going to develop is a rather long frozen conflict. So basically what has occurred in the Republic of Georgia, their two breakaway provinces, I think you're going to see that on a much larger scale. I don't know. I seriously doubt that, given the Russians' military performance, I kind of seriously doubt that they're going to be able to decapitate the leadership in Kiev and install a puppet. That would be one way it would end. I don't foresee American ground troops, nor do I foresee, if that does happen, that making too much of a difference. So I am, extremely pessimistic at this point. It seems like at every turn, when there has been some sort of progress, and this was recently outlined by the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, whenever there was some sort of proposal, it was undermined by the West. So that's deeply unfortunate, but in keeping with their character. So point for consistency, I suppose. But no, I think that we are in for unfortunately, for at least another couple of years of this.
Well, I wish it was a better report, but whatever the future holds, it's important for us to understand the background here and the context and the fact that there are, in fact, other options open should we at some point be able to encourage our leaders to pursue them. So, James Carden, you are a columnist for Globetrotter Media and also an expert in this field. Thanks for your excellent work in this area, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.